need shells and they need missiles and they need money. First of all, to fire at the Russians and to pay their soldiers and keep their government running. They are under siege. The Russians are attacking, and they don't have enough shells and missiles to fire at them. And that is resulting in their troops having to retreat in several places over the past couple of weeks and months. They don't need more tanks and planes and guns. They've got enough of them at the moment, but they need stuff to fire out of them. And that's linked into this stuff about the war economy for the defence industry.
So the government says it will spend an extra £75 billion on the military over the next 6 years to put the defence industry on a war footing. Well, let's speak now to Tim Ripley, who's a defence analyst and editor of the Defence Eye website. Hi, Tim.
Good morning.
Will this make the UK by far the largest defence power in Europe, as the Prime Minister says?
Well, it'll certainly put the biggest price tag on defence ever in British history. Whether that actually translates into more tanks, more planes, more ships, and more soldiers and sailors and airmen for the British Armed Forces, that's a different matter. But certainly, in terms of spending, it's big.
And are we right to be putting ourselves on a war footing? We've had lots of messages from listeners who say, "Look, we've got trouble at home, whether it's the NHS or schools or the criminal justice system, whatever it might be, billions and billions of pounds being found for the defence industry. Is it necessary? Do we need to be on a war footing?"
Well, I'm not quite sure what a war footing means. The Prime Minister yesterday talked about how that we're going to spend all this money on. He talked about putting the defence industry on a war footing, but he said Britain was not in danger of being attacked. So their messaging is a bit confusing. They obviously want to have the ability to surge production of shells and missiles, which is the kind of thing that Ukraine needs right now. But the government is very loath to obviously try and translate that into any kind of wider discussion of Britain being attacked. Because remember, a few months ago, Mr. Shapps got in a real pickle when he hinted about conscription, and he was slapped down very badly by the Prime Minister for trying to get stuff off the message of the election, which is not about conscription or Britain being attacked tomorrow.
In terms of the support specifically for Ukraine, what do they most need from us in the war with Russia?
Well, they need shells and they need missiles and they need money. First of all, to fire at the Russians and to pay their soldiers and keep their government running. They are under siege. The Russians are attacking, and they don't have enough shells and missiles to fire at them. And that is resulting in their troops having to retreat in several places over the past couple of weeks and months. They don't need more tanks and planes and guns. They've got enough of them at the moment, but they need stuff to fire out of them. And that's linked into this stuff about the war economy for the defence industry. You can call it sort of an equivalent of the World War II arsenal of democracy, the phrase of President Roosevelt.
Tim, it's really good to speak to you. Tim Ripley there, defence analyst and editor of the Defence Eye website. And we'll keep across what does emerge from those talks in Germany.
Part of the reason why the UK has decided to increase its defence spending, pressure from America. The man who wants to be the next president of America, again, Donald Trump, said recently that he would encourage Russia to attack NATO members who didn't spend enough on defence. Is Europe being forced to react in case he returns? Let's get the analysis of the New York Times chief diplomatic correspondent for Europe, Steve Erlanger. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
How much do you think Donald Trump figures in these announcements?
Well, people talk about Trump proofing. I think the election figures more in Rishi Sunak's thinking right now than on Donald Trump. He's got a big hurdle before that. There's also a general recognition in Europe that Ukraine is at the moment losing the war, and that NATO is going to be tested, and that the countries of NATO, Britain included, simply aren't spending enough money on the military, that they have to go back up to at least closer to Cold War levels. I mean, Sunak, I think yesterday, announced something like £3 billion pounds to Ukraine a year, which is very nice. and it's number 2 after Germany. But America just did $60 billion. So the difference is quite real, but the sense of threat is also quite real. And NATO, in its summit in July, is going to push countries to begin to spend more like 3% of gross domestic product a year on the military, up from 2%. Now, whether this is Trump proofing or not, I think it's more Russia proofing.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, if Trump does become president again, how will this change his demeanor towards his approach towards Europe and towards funding Europe?
Well, it's always hard to know what Trump is going to feel on any given day. But I mean, a steady theme of his for 40 years has been America's allies don't spend enough in their own defense. They take advantage of the United States. They hide under the American military might, and it's unfair. So he is transactional, and countries that respond by spending more will be okay in his view. And this year, at least, all of NATO is supposed to reach a goal. The aspiration was 2% of GDP by this year. In the summit, they're going to create a new goal, but something like 20 of the 32 NATO members now will this year at least spend 2% of GDP, including Germany.
But there are still many countries who don't, and the hope is that because perhaps the UK is increasing their spending, that might bring other people in line or up to, I suppose, 2%. Again, this is speculation. Have things changed enough over the last couple of years for those European countries to actually up their spending and say, well, you know, maybe we do have to be more responsible ourselves instead of relying on America?
I do think this is happening. I mean, there's certain countries like Belgium that will never spend 2%. Italy doesn't spend enough. Spain, people who are farthest away from Russia tend to be spending less. They just don't see the same threat. But the important thing is the biggest countries are reaching that amount. So in some, there's been a big increase in military spending in the last, I'd say, 4 years, certainly since the annexation of Crimea in 2014. I don't think it's enough. I think 3% ought to be the real goal. The Poles will spend 3.5% of GDP. They're right next door. So partly it's a matter of the threat people feel, but I do think, you know, Britain plays an extraordinarily important role inside NATO and at the United Nations and as part of Western security. And it's beginning, or that's unfair, but it is now living up to the world's expectations for it. It's not just Trump.
Steve, thank you very much for talking to us. That's Steve Erlanger, who's a New York Times chief diplomatic correspondent for Europe.